Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's tribute to Frank Daniel. This is a part number 2. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 very distinguished guests from very different parts of the United States. They all have one thing in common, one person. The person is they all remember Frank Daniel. Some of them even much more personally. Here they are. These are the sons of Frank Daniel meeting in Karlovy for the very first time. This is Martin, who teaches the methodology of Frank. Martin Daniel. And this is Michal, his older son, who has absolutely nothing to do with the movies, he says. Although he does play one quite significant part in the movie you are about to see this year in September. So he will tell us all about the shooting on the very end of this tribute. On the very left side is Ted Brown. Some of you might remember him from this morning tribute, part number 1, when he did the analysis of Someone Like It Hot, the movie. It took 4 hours. But he's not tired, he says, so we'll see. On my right hand is Alex Nibley, who worked as an intern at the Sundance Festival, which is actually something we will be starting this talk today, about the development of the Sundance Festival. And he started there as an intern. And his very first day, the very first minute of his first day of the internship, he was given a task to pick up Frank Daniel from the airport, who was coming to Sundance for the very first time to work. So he'll tell us all about that. And see, some people here have 2 first names as their names, Michal Daniel and Martin Daniel. Some people have 2 last names as their names. So I've been training to say it. It's Sterling Van Wagenen. It's only 2 names, but it sounds like 3. Who is the very first executive director of the Sundance Institute. So he worked with Frank Daniel very closely, Frank being the artistic director, and Sterling being the executive director. So he will tell us all about that, and that's actually how we start. And now, gentlemen, you can sit. Anyway, because, see, this is a complicated talk. There are only a few people in this country who remembers Frank Daniel from the FAMU days. And the general public doesn't know much about him. So in our image, right now, from the information we learned, is that Robert Redford basically called Frank Daniel and said, "You are the only person who can lead and develop the Sundance Institute." But I'm kind of assuming it was more complicated than that. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, it was, like everything in life, it was more complicated than that. We were just reminiscing a few minutes ago. My first contact with Frank was an interview I conducted with him when he was the chair of the film department, co-chair of the film department with Milos Forman at Columbia University. And Frank had been recommended to me as someone when we were first starting the Institute. We had no board, we had no staff, we had no money. All we had was a twinkle in Robert Redford's eye, wanting to start some kind of an institute to help independent filmmakers. And so I had a good friend who worked at the National Endowment for the Arts in Catherine Weiler, who was the daughter of the great German-American filmmaker William Wyler. And Kathy had known Frank for a number of years, and she recommended that I speak with Frank at Columbia, that he could make some kind of an as yet undefined contribution to the startup of the Sundance Institute. So I flew to New York, and Frank very graciously hosted me in his office, and I explained to him what Mr. Redford's vision was for the Sundance Institute. And Frank, in a very genial, very fatherly way, nodded his head a lot and said, yes, I'd be happy to participate. and we were trying to set up a planning meeting. And I had spoken with Mr. Redford about Frank, about his background at the Czech Film School in Prague, at the American Film Institute, then at Carleton College, then at Columbia at the time. And Redford was very impressed with Frank's background and credentials, but was a little suspicious of the fact that Frank was Czech and European. Robert Redford, if those of you who haven't seen many of his films know that he considers himself a quintessentially American filmmaker and actor, and so he was a little suspicious of the European background. But nonetheless, he said, no, if Frank is somebody you think should be involved, then let's go ahead and get him involved. So I invited Frank to come to the very first planning meeting for Sundance, which was held at the Sundance Resort. And as we were talking a little bit earlier with Pablo, we got to within a month of the first planning meeting, and I made a call to Frank's office at Columbia, and I got no return phone call. And we got within 3 weeks of the first planning meeting. I called again. I still got no return phone call. So we got within 2 weeks, and I called every day, and I left messages for Frank, and I finally got a return phone call from one of the secretaries in the film school who said, oh, by the way, he's in Puerto Rico on vacation. And so, fearing that if I couldn't get Frank, Redford would move on to somebody else.
But Sterling, why was he the right person? Tell us the reasons. Why was he the right person?
At the time, you have to remember some of the history of American independent filmmaking. At the time, the word independent wasn't even used. It was regional filmmaking. These were filmmakers who were doing low-budget films in different regions of America. There were some filmmakers who were doing stories from the South, from the Western United States, from the Midwest. And these films had no distribution.
So the movies from the West never traveled to the East?
Yes, the movies never traveled to the East. The movies from the South never traveled to the North. They were very poorly distributed.
So it was like with the European movies now. They never left their home country in a way.
That's right, that's right. It's like having a Czech cinema that never goes beyond the Czech Republic, right? And one of the reasons that the films never traveled is because by and large the screenplays were so bad. And so when I came to understand, and when Mr. Redford came to understand what kind of contribution Frank could make to improving the quality of the screenplays, and you began to see the work he'd done with people like David Lynch and with Terrell Malick, it just became very clear and very obvious that Frank was a key element.
Well, you said that he was a father figure, that he listened to you in a fatherly way. What do you mean by that?
Well, Frank was a very large man with gray hair and a gray beard at the time I knew him at Sundance. But more importantly than his physical presence, and this again is the reason we wanted Frank to come from Puerto Rico from his vacation, more than his physical presence, Frank had a very gentle manner working with screenwriters. He was not threatening at all. He was not a bully. He was not critical. He used a kind of Socratic method to draw out the screenwriters and to ask the right questions so that the screenwriter would come to the obvious conclusion that Frank already had in his head, but wouldn't tell the screenwriter. So the point was, we had very bad scripts in the independent community in America, and Frank had a method and a personality that lent itself to the improvement of those scripts. So to conclude the other story, and then I'll turn it back to you. So I just sent Frank a round-trip ticket from Puerto Rico to Salt Lake City back to New York. I showed up at the airport still having no communication with him. Frank stepped off the plane, and the rest, as they say, is history.
You know, your wife was telling me that he was also very nurturing in terms of cooking for people. So does it mean that it was part of his script development to feed the young screenwriters first? So they get more creative?
He always said that he was a cook first and a filmmaker. later.
Whenever Frank disappeared at Sundance, we couldn't find him. We finally figured out he was out in the forest looking for mushrooms. That was always his default position.
You don't do mushroom pickings in the United States. So. You don't.
I have to tell the mushroom story because he picked all the
mushrooms. I was wondering who was going to pick up on that.
He was picking all the mushrooms, and of course Americans at that time at least did not know you can eat mushrooms safely. So
we thought they were toadstools.
Yeah, toadstools, yeah. And so he pickled a big thing of pickled mushrooms, and he said, you guys have to try this. And it was literally only the closest acolyte who decided they would, risk their life. If Frank told them to eat these mushrooms, then they would die with him.
Well, now I understand the method. So the bad screenwriters get poisoned by the bad mushrooms, and only the good screenwriters can survive. So.
And so they ate the few mushrooms, and finally everybody ate the mushrooms and thought they were great. So that's the mushrooms.
No commitment was too great to make a film.
Well, Sterling was just saying that there were already some significant results before he came on board. One of the significant results was the David Lynch, kind of saving David Lynch for the filmmaking profession. And there's a very interesting thing that Ted Brown told me a while ago, that the very first class, Ted, right, which Frank Daniel taught, was actually like the very basic of the new Hollywood. So if you could elaborate on that, because it's a fascinating information.
Yeah, I was a child at the time, but Frank's first stop after he left FAMU in the Czech Republic was to be the founding director of the American Film Institute Conservatory. And the first group of students that he admitted to that conservatory, the first class included David Lynch, Terrence Malick, Paul Schrader, Caleb Deschanel, one of the great cinematographers, Frederick Elms, who shot all of David Lynch's films, the screenwriters Tom Rickman and Gil Dennis. Tom wrote Coal Miner's Daughter. Gil did Black Stallion, and most recently Walk the Line, the Johnny Cash biopic. Matthew Robbins, Jeremy Kagan. I mean, these were all people that were in a very small first class. How many students were in that class? It was like, that was just about it. It was 20. It was at the most 20 people.
I think you got all of them.
Yeah, and these were a group of men, and it was almost all men, who redefined American cinema, and they were all students of Frank's. I think one of the things that should be said today on a day honoring his memory is that, if you were to look back at the history of film teaching since its infancy, and include, the great Soviet teachers as well as French and others, no single teacher had as great an impact on cinema as Frank. I think he was the greatest film teacher, full stop. You look at his contributions to Czech cinema, you look at that first class, the AFI, and then his students at Columbia, all of the people that went through the Sundance labs during its 10 or 12 years when he was the artistic director. Yeah, 300 filmmakers that went through Sundance. And then when he was the dean of the film school at USC, the filmmakers that went through there, including those who are now influencing television. Shonda Rhimes, who, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, she has every single program on one network on Thursday night. Andrew Marlowe, who wrote Air Force One and created a television series, Castle, which is one of the greats. All of these people, these are 5 institutions and at least 3-4 generations of American filmmakers, plus the Czechs. And then there was all the work that he did in Europe in the 80s and 90s, bringing back screenwriting to the youth, from that to the European culture. It was a phenomenal contribution.
And I think if I could just add, if I can just add to that, he also taught teachers, because all 3 of us here were taught by him, and there were many, many other teachers he taught. And now actually we're engaged in various programs where we're training trainers and teaching teachers. So it's really it's a geometric multiplication that takes place where it just keeps spreading on.
But I have to say one thing that's very important. There are many contributions that he made to the world of cinema, and one of them was analysis, which happened in that class. Because all those kids were bored. Okay, he brought some stuff from Russia and Czechoslovakia, and they were sitting there, they were leaning back there going, he's going blah, blah, blah. So he went, okay, kids, what movie do you like? And they said, Stagecoach. Okay. So he turned on Stagecoach for 10 minutes, and then he asked, how many cameras? How many cuts? What kind of a movie is this? Oh, you didn't notice how many cuts? Okay, you all smoke. So pull out your matches, and we'll run it back 10 minutes. And put on a match for every cut. And now tell me how many cameras and how many cuts. Screen analysis began in that class.
Thank you. That was kind of pointing at me, and he's right, that because we did cover a little bit the beginnings of the Sundance, and I already mentioned the David Lynch and kind of the fact that he probably wouldn't be a filmmaker without Frank Daniel. There is a dramatic story about it, which like nobody knows. There's a little bit about it on the internet, but the sources sort of vary, and I don't even know where the truth lies. So maybe you could tell us about the debut film Eraserhead, and although, you know...
I'll keep it short, and Martin and Michal may know a little bit more than I, but at the time all of the fellows were invited to make their own films, and Eraserhead started off with a very short script. It was, a very bad short script that was a big idea, and David started to work on it, and it took a lot longer than he thought, and he was starting to run out of the resources to make it. And the people that were running the AFI at the time, George Stevens Jr. and Charlton Heston, wanted to put all of the resources into a big feature film and have one student fellow direct it. And Frank was furious, and the students were especially furious. They came to him and they said, "This is wrong. We were all promised a chance to make our own film. This is a complete corruption of the idea that brought us here." And he listened to them, and he heard them, and he decided to go and champion them against the people that were running the program. So far.
Let him finish. Please.
And she said, dude, you did not come from communist Czechoslovakia to censor your students in the United States. No way. Okay, so it's a piece of shit script. Which it was. But he's succumbed. Mom said, so he did.
I didn't know that. So his wife compelled him to go and defend David and the other fellows against this encroachment on their opportunity. And he prevailed. David was able to finish his film. The people that ran the AFI did get that one feature film made, but Frank got into a lot of trouble and ended up having to leave the AFI. There was a famous headline in Variety, it was on the front page, "Danielle in the Lion's Den." And so he lost his position in the AFI, but he did so defending the freedom and the opportunity of students, and this was the theme that ran throughout his life. I saw it at USC.
So what does it say about him, really, as his teaching being completely irreplaceable with his personality? There is Yeah, that's
Actually,
something Alex
expanding
could elaborate on. Yeah.
On that story was something Frank told me that I think illustrates the kind of personality he had that made him such an extraordinary person and teacher. He was so incredibly learned. He was deeply erudite about the history of aesthetic philosophy and all this kind of stuff. And yet everything that he taught was completely practical. And he told me about the story of David Lynch's Making Eraserhead. And he said, you know, David never worked with script very well. But he had these visual images. And so he said, I got him film, I got him end cuts, you know, that the studios were casting off. Short it, there you go. From the studios to be able to shoot Eraserhead because he believed that David Lynch had a visual image that would work. So even though he had a bad script, he recognized something in his student that was of value, and he was willing to adapt the method of production to the student rather than forcing the student to toe the line, come back, get me the script I want, blah, blah, blah. I think that's very representative of who he was as a man and who he was as a teacher.
Also, after he resigned, he made sure that David made the film. Okay, he was gone. We were broke. We were eating rice. But Dad made sure that David made the film. That was a man.
Yeah, I think we are getting here somewhere because like many teachers are very knowledgeable. Many teachers try to be practical. Many teachers try to sort of be helpful for the students. But there's some absolutely unique quality which made Frank Daniel impossible to be forgotten. It's very difficult to talk about somebody who just taught somebody. It's very unusual. Usually we talk about directors, actors, maybe there are lucky some screenwriters. It's very unusual to talk about a mentor who would influence people in the way he did. So if you then, gentlemen, maybe each of you try to name one quality which would distinguish him from the gazillions of the script teachers which are all over the world.
Yeah, I think it's a really simple word. It's generosity, you know. And he absolutely loved film. He loved filmmakers. He loved writers. And what he wanted to do was to give to them everything he could from himself. There was never anything other than that, you know, impulse involved with him. So he was just constantly. That was what he loved to do, and that was what he did. You know, it was just give.
What was he giving them though? What was it?
He never took it, always gave. I don't remember a single time that he wanted to take something. He wanted to give.
But what did he give?
Veronika, I would say what he gave you, what he gave you was the confidence that you could do it.
Yes.
In the most competitive industry in the world, you would take a bad script to Frank, and he would read it, and you would walk away from a meeting with him believing that you were going to win an Oscar. And not in a false or even inflated way. You know, and
back to
that
David
was,
Lynch.
you know, that's
David
what
Lynch said he was my best teacher. He criticized, but in a good way. The criticism helped me. I mean, he spiraled things up. He never hurt anybody. It was always a spiral up. Okay, so this sucks dog shit. So we have to fix it. Here's how you fix it. Okay? He never told you this is garbage. Go away. It never happened. He always helped.
I also think we have this image of the screenwriting labs in Sundance as being a fun thing to do, Sterling. Like, you know, people go outside, there is a ski resort, you know, it's June, everything is green, they have a little bit of fun, and then all those wonderful scripts come out of it. Ted was telling me that especially female students often cried after the sort of consultancy with Frank Daniel, that they were terrified that they would disappoint him and that they wouldn't perform sort of the level of creativity he was expecting. Can you tell us a little bit about how exactly the scripts were developed? Because I think, or you gentlemen choose.
I saw you pick up the microphone. I saw pre-verbal tension over there.
As long as there's always just one talking, you can do whatever you want.
Well, to understand Frank's contribution at the June laboratory at Sundance, you have to imagine yourself being a filmmaker who comes with a script that you believe in and your closest friends believe in, but nobody else believes in. And then you have to recognize that in order to work on your script at Sundance, what you're going to do is you're going to shoot a portion of your script, 1 scene, 2 scenes, 3 scenes with actors, and then you're going to do a very simple edit. But then comes the interesting challenge, because Robert Redford is going to show up on your set and watch you direct actors. A director like Sidney Pollack is going to show up on your set and watch how you direct and how you direct the camera. And then you're going to have screenwriters like Waldo Salt or Tom Rickman show up in the editing room and tell you what needs to happen to your script. So even though Mr. Redford had this sort of vision for a place where the competition of the marketplace didn't impact your experimentation as an independent filmmaker, the pressures were still enormous when you think about that talent with that kind of visibility, looking at your script and your work and criticizing it. The huge contribution Frank made was to take the edge off of all of that and to come to you as a filmmaker personally and give you, as Alex said, give you the personal confidence that no matter what Robert Redford said, or Sidney Pollack, or anybody else, or Jeremy Kagan, no matter what anybody else said, you still had intrinsic worth as a filmmaker, and you still could make a good script out of this. It was that generosity, that confidence, that took the edge off the competitive nature of the lab experience at Sundance.
So would you say Robert Redford was the bad cop and Frank Daniel was the good cop?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Good cop, bad cop.
Division of labor.
Yeah, division of labor.
I made a photo of that. Okay, Robert Redford.
It is the only photo we have available. Everybody knows it here now.
Behind his dad.
You know, one of the things we haven't touched on yet, Veronika, in Alex and Martin and Sterling's description of Frank's generosity, is a receptive quality he had, which was the ability to elicit and draw out from you stories that you had within you that you didn't know. And with Frank, and this is something that sitting in on analysis doesn't really do justice to the whole of him, is that Frank had this capacity to listen, and in listening and also sharing of himself, start this process of exchange that led to discovery. And that was a big part of the feeling of confidence that he gave, and I think a big part of his mark as a teacher was that he didn't just broadcast ideas. He had a way of eliciting from you the things within you that could make for great stories. And I watched this happen over and over, and I experienced it myself as a student. And it was much less systematic, it was much more informal in working with him. But he, in sharing great things from his own life and his own stories, managed to pull from you something that you didn't know that you had. And this was the soft, the good part of him. Because I was up at Sundance, and you'd watch, a screenwriter would come out of one of these sessions, whether it was with Redford or with one of the screen, and they'd be devastated. They would just, their head would be spinning because they thought they had a great project, and now it was a mess. And Frank would always make sure that they had an afternoon or a morning for no one to bother them to recover. And then either he or one of the other resource fellows, one of the others, would sit and talk, and they'd listen. What are you thinking? How will you address this? What do you think your character has within you to, and suddenly the writer, instead of being focused outward, would go in and find within themselves the answers to these problems. And I think that was a thing that made him, that and this moral compass I was talking about, this love of freedom, which I think is very distinctly Czech. I think
you mean the moral sense?
The moral sense, this sort of resistance to bullying, this love of independent, free expression, that was something that it was just a part of who he was. It was certainly very unique in the United States to find someone with that temperament.
So maybe
at the time that he was running FAMO, one floor above was a secret police. There was a gate, iron gate. I mean, to this day, the stairs are not repaired. Below they are. Above him, one floor, was a secret police, okay? And he was destroying them one floor below with humor, and fun.
And food.
And food. Exactly.
So Alex was telling me that the main part of teaching was always kind of across the street from the university at the bar, which is a very Czech thing, I must say. I don't know if he didn't introduce this method into the United States as well.
Well, yes, that's true, and it's yeah. We would watch his analysis class, which I did for 2 years. I went through 4 semesters of it, which I never paid for, by the way. I'm paying that. No, actually, that was.
You were sitting in. That's what we call it.
Yeah, this was a commitment. This was a conversation that I had in a bar because after the class was over, it was a 3-hour class, but it didn't end there because there was a cadre of students that would always follow Frank across the street to the bar. And that's where the real education happened.
Exactly.
and we would talk. And in one of those conversations, by the way, I said, Frank, I feel bad because I have never paid for the classes that you've invited me to come to. And he said, and I said, well, here's the thing, Frank. I'll just make you this pledge that I will be as generous with the information you've given me as you have been giving it. I said that just kind of in passing, I guess, but I remember it. And so now I've been teaching film analysis at Utah Valley University for 14 years. And for the last 3 years, we have opened those classes to the public. And we announce it on Facebook, and we have people come in and say, this week we're going to watch this movie, and come in and we'll talk about how he does this or that and that. So I like to think that I'm working on the future of Frank Daniela stuff, along with Martin and
so there's an institute, kind of.
There is a nation
in process.
Yes, it is. We are hatching an
institute. It's a good time to bring that up because that is the impulse that's driving us, and we're at the stage that Sterling mentioned where it's just a twinkle in our eye, really, but we are announcing the formation of the Frank Daniel Institute, and the idea is that, first of all, we want to make all of the materials, lectures, things like that available online to the broadest possible public. Create new materials with Alex has a terrific program that he's designed, which is a film analysis program for an iPad. You can talk a little bit more about that. And it's basically like using the new technologies which exist now to make a virtual screenwriting school online that we want to make accessible to all of you and to the broadest possible public. And then eventually start offering workshops, and as part of that also use distance education. In other words, I see it as eventually you'll be able to send us a script, we'll be able to give you notes after you have gotten to know us through a in-person workshop, and this process can continue, in a much more open and accessible way than I think currently film schools are, because when we do these works.
They already like it. It doesn't even exist.
Well, you know, when we came up with the idea, it was at a film school, and there were 5 students in the room, and they had the same reaction. And they said, "Whatever we can do, we want to do it." You know, so I kind of feel the energy is behind it, and we're very excited about it. And I think it's in that same spirit of generosity that we want to put it out there.
We want to preserve, first of all, we want to gather all the information we can about Frank, and we want to preserve it. I now have had people send me videos, and I have over 100 hours of Frank's analysis sessions. It's not digital at this point, so we have begun the process of digitizing those. Eventually, we want to make those available to all the public, so all of you would be able to have experienced the same analysis sessions that we experienced. What you can't experience is the bar afterwards, I'm sorry. The other thing we want to do is we want to spread the word, because where people know about Frank, the respect for him is very deep. And so we want to broaden the knowledge of people who know about him. And the third thing is to take his work to the other level. We have new technologies now that Frank never got the chance to work with. We have, the phenomenon of episodic serials is something I just wish that we could sit down and talk to Frank about, but we're going to have to do that on our own and figure out how his theories apply to producing episodic television.
Video games. And video games.
Absolutely.
He
Absolutely.
was way ahead on that.
Well, I'll tell you, one of my great regrets is that I actually set up a meeting between Frank and the head of a video game company. Because I was studying at UCLA, I was studying game design at the same time. And I set up a meeting. He had car trouble, and the meeting never happened. So I would have loved to just listen to this conversation between Frank and a pioneer in gaming.
No, I mean, the thing is that, this is why we want to exploit these new technologies to do this, because Frank was always, even though you see the picture of, a guy who looks like Santa Claus, he was on the cutting edge always. He was always looking, what's the new thing? How can we use it? How can we use it to tell stories, right? So the thing that was new, I think, at Sundance was you guys got cameras from Sony.
Yes.
And he said, we're going to use these to shoot the scenes. It's the perfect learning tool. Nobody had ever done that before. It was very much resisted by filmmakers who said, what is this video? We want to shoot film, right? There was that whole digital divide that hasn't been crossed. And he was adamant that this was the way of the future, and this was the way that you could learn everything and then apply it, right? And laser discs.
It was money again. He wanted kids to use digital because you can reuse it. Okay, you can take that tape and you can erase it and you can use it again.
Do you guys have any questions? There's Elena.
You covered really well his influence on American cinema, and I was wondering if for his great influence he had in Czechoslovakia, he actually used it while teaching in America. For instance, did he ever use the films from the Czechoslovakian filmmakers,
sure,
the analysis, and what if he sort of used his experience from Czechoslovakia, being some kind of an ambassador to that, and even if he used other foreign filmmakers?
Well, this was the thing, like what made when he came back to Europe, right? What made the method very much applicable is he was always interested in boundaries and breaking the rules and making different kinds of films. It was nothing to do with a Hollywood or classical approach. So when we were taking the film analysis classes, actually the first film he analyzed at the American Film Institute, maybe after Stagecoach, was the cutting edge of the time was The Conformist of Bertolucci. And they spent a week going through The Conformist, looking at every aspect of it, script, costume design, directing, editing, and literally analyzed it on every level for a week. And that's a very, if you've seen The Conformist, it's a very deconstructed film, very daring for its time, very interesting how it came together and all of that. So that was one of the first things he did at the AFI. And he was always interested in those kinds of films that play with the possibilities, but still move an audience, right? I think that's the final thing, is he was always, the theory is very practical and pragmatic, and it always had to do with what is the audience experiencing, and is it what you want them to experience, right? It was nothing abstract about it, nothing ethereal. It was always about what is it that people sitting in the theater are going to experience, and are you making a film for people, basically, right?
Very practical.
But to go to your question about Czech cinema in particular, I mean, two films I remember him analyzing when I was in graduate school and talking about were Closely Watched Trains and Loves of a Blonde. He showed and analyzed both those films, two very different pictures, one an adaptation, the other an original, but both, you know, imbued with the Czech cinema that he was a part of. He also used to talk about Vera Chytilova's work and what it was like to teach her.
Speak more concrete, tell more.
Pardon me?
Tell more details about that.
You know, he, as I said, he had an appreciation for freedom, and he, you know, she was quite an anarchic spirit, I gather. I have not had the pleasure, but the film, especially Daisies, was such a, you know, crazy adventure. But it was one he seemed to have enjoyed unleashing this very free spirit into the world. The other, just to keep it short, the other part of his experience that he mentioned, not often, but in passing, that made a very deep impression on me, had to do with his time when he was the dean at FAMU during the Soviet invasion in '68. And he was very proud of the fact that when that event happened, he told the people that ran the equipment room to unlock the equipment room and told the students to take the cameras out and to film what was happening, so that the world...
to toss the results across the walls of foreign embassies. Okay? I mean, otherwise it would have... the world would not have known what happened here. That was brilliant.
So in addition to screening those films, he had these stories, and that one in particular left a very deep impression on me, because it speaks to the responsibilities of professors outside of the classroom, and the responsibility and obligation.
And I have to add that he risked his
Michal
life.
can't wait to get his acting part, so...
He risked his life doing that. He knew perfectly well that he told a whole bunch of students to go out. He unlocked the doors. He gave them the film. He gave them the cameras, and he told them to toss the film across foreign embassy walls. I mean, you know, if somebody told, he'd be dead.
But it's a certainly a story worth researching, that's for sure. So, as you can see, like, Michal can't wait to be acting for you guys. So we have to sort of start the movie. but there is time for one or two questions from the audience. So if you want to know anything. So Michal,
Yes.
when you were 5,
Yes.
your father directed you in his movie this year in September. Your scene is on the very beginning of the movie. What are your memories of this?
One of the reasons why I'm a photographer is that I felt that this whole thing was a total pretense. I mean, you guys are making a movie, and then people are looking at the movie, and I saw it in color, and now it's in black and white, and you know, everybody in the movie is gone. I was appalled.
It's a lovely movie, by the way.
It is. But I was appalled. I did not like it. I did not like being forced. I was told to say lines that I didn't really want to say.
Well, your father probably didn't want to pay for an extra person, you know. So.
Yeah. So, you know, that's why I walked away from film and became a theater photographer, not a filmmaker. Theater photographer, live theater photographer.
But there's one thing which is fascinating for me, that there are many teachers who spend their lives kind of envying creative people that they don't want to create, you know. That there's very few people who would sort of suppress their ego so much that they only teach, and they don't have the ambition to do their creative work. Your father has done that. Like, he was very creative in the Czech, he was a creative producer, he was writing scripts, he was directing movies, which one of them you'll see. And then he came to America, and he made, I think, a conscious decision to stop doing his own work, which is a big sacrifice in a way. And I don't know if he has done it for the family because he had to, or because he really, like, this sort of pedagogical talent was so big that it was actually just driving him. But that's something impressive.
I think that, you know, there's an element to it that wasn't a suppression of the ego, that actually was a full expression of that. In other words, I think he realized that that's where he had the greatest impact. And he was just thrilled with the success of students and the sense within himself that he had contributed to that. So I don't think it was totally a suppression of the ego. And the other thing he said about it was, you know, I was shipped over here in the wrong box, right? When he was talking to him about America. He said, I'm a screenwriter and a producer, but they shipped me over in a box marked educator. And so at some point he accepted that and embraced it and made literally the most of it. But the last thing that he said was, you know, you can tell us about the making filmmakers rather than films.
Yeah. I asked him, why are you not making movies anymore? And he said, because in the time that it takes me to write or make a film, I can make 10 filmmakers who will make 10 films.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for coming to visit us here to Karlovy Vary.
Thank you.